Thank you. Apologies to those of you who have heard previous versions of this, but this is a new audience. It's a kind of teaching, training course. So since I did like the way some of the speakers have introduced the way in which they actually, their personal lives led them to being interested in political ecology. So I thought I should follow up and start with the story of when I was a little girl, and my father used to work for the sugar factory, and one of the things the trade unions was doing was to take the workers and their families for an excursion once a year. So that one particular year that is kind of lodged in my memory, we were promised we're going to go and see the countryside and get out of the city and experience the countryside. So off we went, very excited. So we arrive at the countryside, and much to my surprise, I was quite young, I was 5, 6. We were actually taken to see a dam. So the whole visual domination of the dam on that landscape, I still remember it, and how stupefied I was about this massive construction in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a natural landscape. And of course I was too young, and I didn't make any connections at the time, just admiring the construction really. It was only later, particularly during my student years in Athens, when there was a massive water scarcity, and which led me to do my PhD actually, and it was only then I started making the connections about that dam and the water coming out of the tap, about how easy we think it is to turn the tap and we get water, but actually in order to have that very simple gesture operate, there is a whole network of infrastructures, technologies, modified natures and human labor involved into that simple gesture. So I tried to excavate those processes that were leading from the dam to my domestic tap and understand what is behind that process of transformation of nature. And as I trained as an architect, and it was all about buildings and the urban, I came to understand that actually it's impossible to understand the urban and how the city functions without understanding how nature outside the cities commodifies, changes in order to accommodate urban development, and how the networks, things underneath, the invisible networks underneath the city function in order to produce the urban as a perfectly functioning entity, social, natural, environmental, socio-environmental and technological entity. And of course, when later on I visited Las Vegas, not for vacation, but because the annual meeting of the Association of American Geographers was taking place there, it was quite clear, because has anyone been for the meeting? Okay, or for any other reason? Yeah.
For the casino.
For the casino.
Yeah, obviously.
That's right, of course. So it's stupefying, because Las Vegas is a strip, literally one street of land in the bloody middle of the desert, and one wonders how is that possible? All these flickering lights, where do they get the energy, where do they get the water, etc. And then of course one visits the Hoover Dam, and it's all there. And again, all these connections between the city and nature, we can't understand one without addressing how the other works. So I'm giving you a kind of background with examples of why urban political ecology, and what is so particular about cities that we should be offering them a special place in political ecology agendas. So apart from the obvious answer that cities are the largest consumers of resources, more than half the population of the world dwells in cities, also cities have always been and still are hubs of both repression and domination, but also they have always been and still are generative forces of new ideas, of big promises for emancipation and freedom. So they encompass this dialectic of everything that's good and bad at the same time about human societies. But apart from this obvious answer of, most of the world's population lives there, as I just explained, we cannot address questions of socio-environmental relations without at least addressing questions about the organization and function of urban environments. But here's where the conundrum starts. Because both the city and nature are ontologically and epistemologically very difficult to tackle. Notoriously, Raymond Williams said that nature is the most complex word in the English language, and the city is too. So then there's an array, a cocktail of ideas, definitions, concepts about what is nature, what is the city. Now if you now start to try and put nature and the city together, you get an explosive cocktail of epistemologically and ontologically convoluted theorizations and concepts. How do we get out of that? Let me just give you some examples, because I say how we get out of that, of these epistemologically, ontologically convoluted ideas and processes. Nature, for one part, has been depicted in theorizations and conceptualizations, theories, sociological theories, environmental theories, on one hand as evil, as a thing out there to be conquered by human beings. The untamed species, threatening species, uncontrolled weather, natural disasters, wild rivers, uncivilized indigenous populations, bad metabolized nature, sewage garbage in the city. All those are challenges to civilized humankind, and we have to address them and conquer and change them and control nature. So nature as evil poses a domain of challenges to human societies to control, master, civilize and tame. Parallel to these depictions of nature, we also have, in parallel historically, depictions of nature as divine, something to be preserved and used as a source of inspiration. The clean green pastures, beautiful flowers, lush forests, organized animal societies, all offer inspiration to human societies. They provide a higher moral, ecological order to which human societies can aspire, and it needs to be preserved as such. Cities. Cities conceptualized as cancers, parasites on the natural and domesticated environments. They make no food, they clean no air, they clean little water. They just are overgrowths on nature and on tumors on nature. Tumors on human societies need to be eradicated somehow. Again, Friedman, cancers, an overgrown organ which takes all the food, so much food it can no longer perform its proper function. As quotes from Odum, Friedman, Meyer. Overgrown monstrosities, glutinous appetites for material goods, fast declining carrying capacities. Only catastrophe awaits such a system of disharmony. So all these dystopian futures, also not just in academic, but also perhaps more so in literature about dystopian cities, cinematic depictions. LA has been destroyed who knows how many times in Hollywood movies, etc., etc. On the other hand, again, in parallel to those depictions, cities are depicted and conceptualized as environmental and cultural resources. They potentially can be more environmentally friendly than we think, because they're compact structures, they offer great economies of scale, they're efficient structures for resource distribution and efficient use of natural resources. Urban density reduces the pressure on rural land, which can potentially eradicate over-intensive farming. Cities potentially can make a great contribution to environmental protection if we envision an en masse per capita change of habits. So if you convince all city dwellers to, say, reduce their water consumption by 1 liter per day across the world, you have a massive change and massive protection, in effect, of water resources. As I mentioned before, cities are generative forces for environmental movements, and it is within cities where we hear the loudest and more important and politically forceful voices against environmental degradation. And much of the physical fabric of cities itself, of the built environment, actually can and has been depicted as a non-renewable environmental resource itself. So our world heritage, from the Parthenon, Taj Mahal to Stonehenge to even some of the historical buildings around Manchester, these are also non-renewable resources. They will never come back, and they need to be protected. So we have this antithetical, almost schizophrenic depictions of both nature and the city throughout modernity. The city as cancer, the city as asset, the nature as a moral order to be preserved and to inspire, nature as wild and uncivilized to be conquered and changed. However, within all these cases, nature is depicted as the other, from which the urban dweller has been alienated and with which she either needs to get back in touch or needs to conquer. So this relationship between city and nature is equally contested. Bookchin, for example, sees the city as the antithesis of nature, as the organic pitted against the artificial, and in the process develops a normative ideal that inscribes to nature a moral order to which human beings should aspire. On the other end of the spectrum, Jacobs said, as early as, quite early, 1961, that is Jane Jacobs, the late, not, we have two Jane Jacobs in our field. So that's Jane Jacobs, the 1960s planner, is now dead. So Jacobs said that urban environments are as natural as the colonies of prairie dogs or beds of oysters. And David Harvey said that actually there's nothing unnatural about New York City. So, to me, in these quotes, and in Lefebvre's work, to which I'll come in a moment, there is the seed of the possibility to go beyond this conundrum of nature-city dualism. So, by reconceptualizing the relationship between nature and the city, urban political ecology, this is where we come in, and tries to get away from this dualism and offers an analysis that contributes to a better understanding of the interconnected processes that lead to uneven urban developments and environments across the world. So drawing upon, I mean, I'm doing a bit of a historical kind of archaeology of knowledge here for the purposes of the, so it's a funny seminar, this one, because it's both scientific, as it were, but we're also trying to teach something. So we all struggle with, playing with this too. We don't want to dumb down, but at the same time we're fully aware that we need to teach. So there you go. So a bit of the archaeology of knowledge on this. So Lefebvre's notion of second nature provides a platform which enables us to discuss this social production of urban environments. For him, it's a quote, nature, there's no nature anymore, it's destroyed as such. It has already been modified fully across the world. It has been reconstructed to another level, the level of second nature. And that second nature is the town and the urban. The town, he calls the anti-nature or non-nature, but yet he calls it a second nature, already going beyond this dualism, oh, what is nature, what is city? So nature is, the city is also natural in a way. The bricks are clay and fire and human labor and energy put into transforming all these things into something that becomes, is it nature or is it non-natural? And then put a million bricks together, or how many bricks does it take to make one building like this? I don't know. Put as many as it takes and you have a building in Manchester. On the other hand, So, is that nature or is it man-made, human, woman-made? It was man-made at the time. The simple example, this park outside here, is that nature? Is it? Any ideas?
It is, yes.
Is it really?
Urban nature.
What is different between that? Every single tree has been transported, who knows where from, like the bricks on this building, planted through human labor, like the bricks have been fired, in order to maintain this park looking like a park. Has everyone noticed how much labor it takes every morning? There's 3 or 4 gardeners, I see them every morning as I walk by, trying to maintain nature in a natural form, in a form that we consider to be a park. Okay, so I'm just trying to break down the dualisms here and say that there is as much nature, human labor, resources, capital investment, and energy involved in producing both a building and a park in a city. So, this is the kind of second nature that Lefebvre talks about, is a produced nature. And it's a second nature. And that heralds the future world, the world of the generalized urban. There is nothing outside the urban anymore. And today, actually, an emerging literature in urban studies, quite fresh from the press, talks about the post-urban, that we can't talk about the urban anymore because everything is urban. It's a global urban. The cities have spread across the country. The entity called city is no longer what it used to be. It's kind of encompassed the whole planet. Anyway, so for Lefebvre, nature as a sum of particularities which are external to each other and dispersed in space dies. Instead, it gives way to a produced space, the urban. The urban defined as assemblies, here's the seed of the whole assemblages literature, and encounters is therefore the simultaneity or centrality of all that exists socially. And as Alex Loftus mentioned yesterday, Neil Smith, and I really urge you're not a political ecologist unless you've read Uneven Development. This is a book you have to read, and it's difficult, but it's also mind-blowing and it's very, very satisfactory. 1984, Neil Smith, Uneven Development, takes all of these Lefebvre's and Marx's ideas to an entirely different level. And then, I mean, Nick Hain and myself and Eric, in our edited book on urban political ecology, tried to put the kind of stigma of political ecology on the map. No, no. Bloody. Later, okay, perhaps later. So an urban political ecology agenda stipulates that there is nothing a priori unnatural about produced environments like cities or dammed rivers or irrigated fields. Produced environments are specific historical results of socio-environmental processes. But at the same time, and this is very important, yes, we want to go beyond that dualism, but at the same time, the answer we give to the question, what is nature, what is the city, is deeply political and it matters. So, just 3 kind of out of the top of the head, 2 examples. If you're a deep ecologist, nature is a moral value and order, is something awesome to be preserved, left alone by human beings. If you're a technocratic, if you have a technocratic, technocentric approach, nature is an endless resource. We can keep on developing, economic growth will trickle down, technology will solve the problems. That's the dominant imaginary phenomenon. For ecological modernization, it's a bit of both. We have to manage to the best of our ability without compromising. But for every single historical imaginary of nature and the city, these questions matter, and it is the answers to these questions we give to these questions that inform our praxis of socio-environmental transformation. So the key questions we ask in urban political ecology is how and why what we perceive of and conceptualize as the relationship between the city and nature changes over time. These are the questions I grapple with in my work. What are the power relations involved in changes of the way this relationship is conceptualized and institutionalized? Who decides what is a good urban environment and a good intervention at any particular historical moment? Who decides and implements urban strategies in the name of improving the environment? Who wins and who loses out of those changes? So the way we conceptualize, manage and institutionalize the relationship between cities and nature lies at the heart of the production of cities and of the reproduction of the Western world. And I do talk, in my work, I talk about Western societies. I claim no expertise about the developing world and all development processes. In fact, the whole so bear in mind, I do talk about Western societies because I need to contextualize what I'm talking about. So, in fact, the whole history of urban change, of planning ideas and praxis, the history of modern environmental utopias itself is a history of ideas and practices generated in order to manage this relationship between nature, society, nature and cities. The whole history of planning, design, architecture is a history of efforts to change nature, change society and change our minds, change the way we conceptualize this relationship. Any change in how we perceive the city-nature relationship involves inevitably changes in the way we perceive ourselves as part of the world, and any change in this conceptualization acts as a catalyst and as a container for a new set of social, environmental and personal imaginaries, which then become institutionalized as social, environmental and personal norms. So, the heavy part of the theory is done. So now I want to talk to you to contextualize what I've just said theoretically through looking at the evolution of the imaginaries and the praxis that institute this nature-city relationship since the beginning of industrialization. And I want to show you how we have moved from collective dreams for a broader socio-environmental transformation to atomized, individualized lifestyle blueprints. And don't worry, I will explain what I mean by all that in a moment. So, I'm going to take you a journey back in time. 19th century, the industrial city, and here's a snapshot of London, and Engels, of course, has given a magnificent snapshot of Manchester. London, the average tenement, Victorian tenement, that is the working class dense housing areas in London or Manchester, had actually less space available to move than someone who was incarcerated in prison at the same time. So these dens in which thousands of beings herd together, is a quote of 1883, and there are 7 people living in one underground kitchen, a child lying dead in the same room. To get to these dens, you have to penetrate courts reeking with poisonous gases arising from the accumulation of sewage and refuse. New York, same story. A seething mass of humanity, ignorant, vicious, depraved, that the hardest seem to belong to our species. It is almost a matter of congratulation that the death rate is 57%. It's a quote from the American magazine. Paris. Nothing of the luminous streets on the Parisian boulevards at the time. How ugly Paris seems, how one chokes in these narrow and dark, dank corridors that we like to call the streets of Paris. One would think that one is in a subterranean city, heavy is the atmosphere, profound the darkness. The Thames River was the great stink of London, the one we now like taking wonderful walks along its banks. The Houses of Parliament, there was consideration to move the Houses of Parliament at the time because the members of Parliament couldn't tolerate the stench that was coming up from the Thames. So air and water pollution choked both Manchester, London and Paris. Nature in the city, the rivers were sewers, there was garbage all over the place. Nature was evil. The air was foul, carrying disease. Drinking water was a lethal act with recurring cholera epidemics. The seething mass of humanity was resembled to low life. and nature and society were clearly in this equilibrium. This relationship was in crisis. And precisely this historical moment, was what gave birth to planning. What gave birth to, not just to planning, but also to ideas, conceptualizations, urban sociology. Marx, Engels were writing at the same time, out of the need to do something, think through what causes that disequilibrium. What I call modern this Promethean project was all about marching in science and technology to bring a balance to this disequilibrium, conquer evil nature in cities. The Victoria Embankment, massive construction in 1865, here underway, here what it looks like. You walk along the streets of any city that has a river, how beautiful nature in the city. Well, it's all concretized, yeah? And an urban child, there's a loss of historical memory of what a river actually looks like, because any urban child thinks this is a natural form for a river to flow within concrete walls. This is the historical moment when this started happening. So embanking the Thames was a matter of imperial pride, became a matter of imperial pride for the British Empire, because an empire so big and so virtuous and so powerful could not possibly have its river/sewage overflowing into the streets of London. You can imagine, with every rain, this river was overflowing sewage around the whole of London and stinking. The construction of the London sewers that would clean the stench was also a matter of imperial pride. For Athens, which was in the making at the time, the best according to the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, the best politician would be the one who would bring water to Athens. So this relationship between city and nature was not only managed through technology, but it was first and foremost managed by radicalizing the ways ways of how we conceptualize what construes nature, what construes urban society, danger, and what types of nature should be expelled from the city, and what types of nature were desirable, we wanted in the city. We wanted parks and trees and kind of limited numbers of wildlife. We didn't want sewage, which is a type of metabolized nature. Yeah, we didn't want filthy rivers. We didn't want stinking, filthy air. And even the implementation of particular technologies were also a matter of how we conceptualize danger. No. I don't know if I should. Yeah, I won't go into. We can discuss it later. So, but not only technology, but the whole urban sociology, as I said, Marxism itself, and the early urban environmental utopias emerged as a need and as a necessity to change this relationship between nature and the city, nature and society, to produce better living conditions, to produce a better primal shelter, to compensate for moments of personal and social disarray. Because, of course, all these social environmental problems were very closely linked to the labor upheaval. You know, the whole edifice of modern capitalism was threatened, not solely, but definitely partly because of this disequilibrium between, because of the environmental problems that the industrialization generated. So, we have the beginning not only of technological innovations, of huge urban technology networks, but also the beginning of a massive generation of new ideas of how we're going to tackle this relationship. And perhaps one of the most famous reconceptualizations of this relationship is Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities. For Ebenezer and Howard, human emancipation and happiness would only emerge through a new relationship between human beings and nature. In his garden cities, what he does is he actually takes the city out into nature. let's forget about it. We've messed up with the cities. Forget about what we have. We're going to build new cities. We'll be harmoniously living with nature. For industrial paternalism, the welfare of the workers would come through a more harmonious relationship between labor, capital, and nature. And many experiments around industrial paternalism would be repeated later in different circumstances under the Fordist deal. The Italian futurists also grappled with this relationship between city and nature and tried to reconceptualize it in an entirely different manner. To them, nature doesn't feature as a source of inspiration or moral order. To them, nature is the milestone around the neck of modernity. Nature as an inspiration is actually what drags human societies down. We have to forget about nature. Any inspiration from nature, they call architectonic prostitution, and they turn instead to science and technology as the powers that can liberate humankind. It is only through our science, through our technology, that we can emancipate ourselves. Nature is never going to do this for us. So, inspired by futurism, fascism also tried to wage basically, literally, war against nature. This one paper with Federico Caprotti that I worked on in your list, and showing how Mussolini made it a matter of his own personal pride to conquer the Pontine Marshes, the swamps south of Rome, that 2 Roman emperors and 3 popes had not managed to conquer and turn into urbanized areas. So fascism put together what they call the rural army of machinery to reclaim this marshland and turn it into cities, and they actually succeeded. So these new modified natures, you know, neither purely natural nor purely human, would be the breeding grounds for the ideal fascist male who could only be, you know, like Mussolini himself was laboring into the process. I find this an amazing picture. This Mussolini himself participate. Okay, it's a show, but showing how human labor, how important human labor was in reclaiming nature for producing this better fascist male. Of course, he was presenting himself as the ultimate fascist male. And of course, the ideal breeding ground for the ideal fascist female who would lead a rural life, work in synergy with nature, support family values, breed, of course, as much as she could, and be subordinated and fertile. For Stalin's plans, I'm just giving you snapshots of different conceptualizations of city and nature around the same time, in different geographical contexts, yet they share many things in common. I'll summarize what they share in common in a moment. Stalin's plans to populate the rural areas of the Soviet Union also involved producing the perfect breeding ground for the ideal communist man and woman. Le Corbusier's and the whole of the modernist movement vision for a radical transformation of human societies and cities was also centrally geared around reconceptualizing the relationship between city and nature. For Le Corbusier, I know he is mainly understood or misunderstood as someone who wanted to concretize everything, yeah? But in fact, the whole idea about this high-rise, massive construction was that they would sit on stilts. So all of these constructions are actually elevated 3 or 4 stories off the ground, and the idea is that they liberate nature or green spaces. So you have a continuum of green spaces running through the city, and at the eye level, your vision is not disrupted by anything. You see nature all around, and you have these constructions above you. So again, reconceptualizing this relationship, but also at the level of the actual dwelling that we see here, is all about bringing air and light into buildings. You know, compare the Victorian tenements you see, Victorian buildings you see around. You know, in Oxford, we would only live in there, and I would never get any light. And I come to Manchester, and suddenly, oh, there is light, because you know, you live in more modern environments. This is what modernism architecture was about. So, again, now, what is common about these early environmental imaginaries is that, first of all, they were all born during times of social change or even social upheaval. Second, they all challenged consciously social norms in order to challenge environmental norms. They consciously knew that unless societies change, or even that there is a dialectical relationship between change in society and changing the nature-society relations. And they envisioned the perfect, either futurist, modernist, fascist, communist home, the perfect futurist, modernist, fascist, communist male, female, not as a name in itself, but the perfect home, the perfect male, the perfect female would come about, would be the natural outcome, almost a positive side effect of a broader transformation of the relationship between nature and society. Now, but what happened after the end of the Second World War was a slow but creeping shift of focus of experimental spatial thinking and praxis from the search for this collective transformation and collective dream for transformation to the pursuit of a more individualized version of the prime shelter, of the individual home. Almost it's a different scale, that the environmental problems have to be engaged at a personal scale, you know, with how you consume, how you live your personal life, etc. During the Cold War period, the urgency to produce a shelter against the evils of communism or capitalism, depending which side you were on, extended from securing the US borders and the sky to securing the individual home. And in the US, this obsession with securing every level of human being existence down to the individual home was exemplified in the massive construction of personal nuclear shelters in every suburban home in the US. And the other side of the Iron Curtain, as it was, the provision of this sheltering, this closing down of ideas and borders is perhaps nowhere so vividly manifested as it was in the erection of the Berlin Wall, but would provide the shelter against, again, communism or capitalism, depending which side you were in. However, even during the 1960s and 70s, as this official praxis was closing down space with the production of national, local or personalized cloisters, radical utopian thinking was actually keeping alive the possibility for openness. The archigram, one of the great kind of planning architectural movements in the 60s, with their idea, produced this amazing idea of the walking city. It was a city that literally had legs that could walk, a city that could not be subjected to this closure and walling up that was taking place. And the situationists that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, their interventions and writings were also about opening up new ways of appropriating the city and redefining public space. The situationist work is, again, speaking of archaeologists of knowledge, at the heart of, or gave birth to what is today known as psychogeographies. However, this alternative utopian thinking of the 60s and 70s never actually found any spatial materialization. After the 70s, the lapse from a quest for a collective dream from transformation to the pursuit of an atomized shelter was further accentuated by the increasing neoliberalization of the production of the built environment. This time, the regression of utopian praxis to atomized blueprints was complemented by the stalling of utopian thinking itself, and numbness of alternative political thought that followed the collapse of the socialist projects across the world. So, the pursuit of a radical change to our relationship with nature was left to the hand of the market. And environmental utopias soon regressed to no more than a search for an atomized versions of the once collective dream for finding this primal shelter. So these lifestyle blueprints are depicted by very voyeuristic, almost images, and prescribed consumerist lifestyles, which are only available today to those who can afford it. These are images from Dubai. So this is Dubai. This is Sanctuary Park in Australia, one of thousands of gated communities across the world, which advertises itself as Australia's leading lifestyle community, which boasts unparalleled security and unparalleled environmental beauty. Heritage Park, outside Cape Town, not historical at all, it's a new construction, takes the gated community idea to a higher level as the residents are enclosed inside high voltage electronic fencing. So if they touch their fences, they're dead. So this kind of, it's very interesting I think because it makes the home, both a shelter, it takes it to a different level because it's a shelter and a prison at the same time. So you're imprisoned within your own shelter.
What is it?
Cape Town, outside Cape Town. As Bauman notes, the search for the primal shelter has come to replace rebellion, which has ceased to be a sensible option. Now this individualized, atomized, the once collective quest for the primal shelter. And the terrain of spatial thinking and practice itself has shifted from the quest for openness and inclusion to a deliberate exclusion, from dreams of collective social transformation to individualized, sustainable, consumerist-led practices. And although, you know, we make no mistakes, earlier utopias were oppressive and were quite rightly criticized for being that, but they were also interestingly committed to keeping social space porous and open. Even something like Buckingham's Victoria, which was a utopian vision for a city that would be well ordered, that would address the social environmental problems, that tried to address these problems through very oppressive social and spatial arrangements where, for Buckingham, in order to avoid social upheaval, the way to do it was, you know, there wouldn't be any pubs, so you couldn't drink, you couldn't gamble, you couldn't, there were no brothels, so you wouldn't have prostitution. So kind of eliminating evil so that there would be no evil. But even in this vision that is quite rightly criticized as massively oppressive, still the city gates, these imaginary city gates, were open to anyone who actually wanted to be part of it. By contrast, contemporary utopias are committed to closing down any pore that remains open between the inside and the outside. And it is this closure, I argue, and not the quest from a nice shelter home per se, that constitutes the signifying difference between contemporary lifestyle blueprints and earlier utopias, be them socialist or capitalist. It is this othering of everything and everyone outside which is also extended to nature today. Nature can enter contemporary lifestyles only after it has been fully processed, fully controlled, fully purified and commodified. It enters only after it has been conquered and disciplined in order to be consumed. And it features mainly as the pleasant backdrop to the gated prime shelters or as a pleasure ground. And these are, I think, very explicit examples of what I'm talking about. You know, here you can see a shark coming your way in your bedroom, perfectly sheltered. Or you can snowboard in Dubai with 50 degrees heat in bottom right, or you can even experience being inside the ocean in the bottom picture, bottom right, without any of the fear or lack of protection, or even physical toll that it would take to actually get yourself at the bottom of the ocean. So, but even what is today become a quite prolific eco-type developments that claim to reinvent the relationship between human beings and nature, in fact, they reinvent the idea of the gated community in many ways, promoting green lifestyles and individualizing the vision of sustainable development. Eco-developments like the BedZ is a company in London that's produced many of these eco-villages. And yes, I mean technologically they're brilliant, they work to a certain, they're not quite zero carbon, but they work well. But what they do is they provide, they're quite expensive, okay, so because they are very high tech, and they provide a personalized, individualized version of sustainable development. And they attract, of course, middle classes that want to be clean and green, but also who can afford to be clean and green. So what is most interesting is that the regression of this utopian thinking to a search for an atomized version of sustainable living is not the characteristic of neoliberal urban development schemes alone. The motto that there is no alternative out there to the current social and environmental arrangements has permeated ways of thinking and acting that cut across class, gender, ethnicity divides. It was very interesting and unsettling. During workshops I held with architecture students in Greece and Vienna recently, the examples I'll show are from Greece. I asked the students after a series of lectures to visualize their dream of alternative living. And what they produced is actually a very surprising and unsettling set of blueprints for prime shelters for a range of individuals. So this is the perfect dwelling for a schizophrenic individual, or a junkie, or a person who is very shy, or a person who is bedridden, or a lonely individual, or a bored individual. The students tend to get bored quite easily. So their understanding of producing alternative livings, very surprisingly, well, actually not that surprisingly given what I theorized, was seen only through an individualized version of an alternative home, of an alternative prime shelter. These are prime shelters that cocoon individuals as if nothing beyond or outside that shelter object mattered. Nature only features as part of the outside in the form of fully controlled elements, conditioned air, controlled sunlight, that can contribute to further sheltering or conditioning the existence of the inside. So for contemporary utopias, the challenge to transform social environmental relations has regressed to the challenge to produce this ultimate perfect architectural object, the perfect cocoon. And indeed it is this individual object today and not society that is supposed to challenge nature, reach for the sky, provide the best living conditions ever. However, what happens in practice is that these fetishized, atomized utopian objects, actually many of those implode upon themselves and turn into debris even while the dream of promoting them is still in the making. Dubai is the classic example of that. The promised paradise that Dubai was offering imploded upon itself while it was in the making. The paradise islands turned into hell while the cranes of their making were still in the sky. The promised utopian luxury lifestyle became dystopian, featuring dilapidated dreams, dried out natures, and then this picture of the, oh, this is so bad. Nobody's telling me it's such a bad quality. This image of the dried out palm tree, I think, is quite extraordinary. And of course, the massive SUVs that were left rotting in the garages as people were literally fleeing the country from the airports. In Spain, Marbella, I think, is also a good example of the pursuit of happiness through gated communities who were offering privatized paradises and ended up in a massive socio-ecological and political and economic disaster, including the dissolution of the Marbella City Council, maybe our Spanish colleagues can tell us more about. The plan for Dongtang City in China, which for years was hailed by planners, architects and academics and geographers as a showcase, eco-city, the love child of all those who imagined that a possible different urbanity was in the making. The plans for this city were also stalled while the city's Communist Party leader is in prison over fraudulent land deals. And I found, I don't know if anyone has seen this movie. Has anyone seen this movie? I found this amazing. It's a film, La Zona. It's about a gated community which actually has this high voltage fence around it. And it shows so beautifully what I was saying before, that it ends up, this paradise becomes a prison. People cannot leave after a series of events. And it becomes what is supposed to be their own paradise, becomes their prison. So ultimately, I would argue, it is the process of ruination more than anything else that distinguishes contemporary utopias to earlier modernist urban thinking, socialist and capitalist. To the extent that the quality of the ruins becomes the ultimate judge of any transformative dream, idea, vision or blueprint, I argue that the key measure of any utopian project is not by how well it succeeds, but rather by how gracefully it can fail. Although now discredited as totalitarian or oppressive, those earlier modernist utopias still inspire or haunt, for better or for worse, our ways of thinking and planning for cities. Howard's garden cities still inspire planning visions, including those for eco-cities. Le Corbusier's ideas, despite their fierce criticism, still provide a unique experimentation in communal living. The Karl Marx Hof in Vienna is still one of the most inspiring, visited, fully lived, highly sought after residence in Vienna, and this is social housing of the 1920s. Archigram's vision for radical transformation of the form and function of cities still holds the power to inspire design and planning practices. So even in their failure, those earlier utopias stand against time and challenge the way we think about socio-environmental conditions of cities. What Binder calls utopias that put radical demands on play have proven that they can fail better than self-referential lifestyle utopias. Of course, it is true, what Sandercock notes, that the failed utopias of our recent past discourage our future attempts. We all have now witnessed both the end of the socialist transformative dream and the failures of the free market to deliver urban prosperity and socio-environmental cohesion. Today, there is no wonder we have a fear of further failure. However, precisely because we are currently in a moment of social disarray and crisis, a new radical imaginary becomes today a need and a necessity rather than an exercise in planning and architecture. And in fact, despite the gloom and doom and the overall fear, we are actually not short of transformative ideas that propose new ways of administering this relationship between human beings, society and nature. But what is the problem is that these ideas, of course, it's very difficult to find a spatial material expression. Think, for example, of Tony Negri's suggestion for global minimum wages. This is a radical proposal that, if we take it seriously trying to implement it, it has to reform socio-environmental relations across the world, because it can't be implemented otherwise. Think of Marc-Olivier Padis' blueprint, Beyond Employment. I think a very very little referenced work, but which provided a unique opportunity to build a European Union based on the recognition that there is no wealth other than human beings. And this report actually never found a material or spatial expression, as it was drowned under in the EU under free market discourses, where human beings and natures are seen as having to adopt to the needs of the market rather than the other way around. So these ideas and many more allude to the possibility for transformation still being open. But what we're missing is a serious engagement, not only from the part of civil society, but also from our part, from the part of academics, in what kind of material form these ideas could take. So we're not short of suggestions for alternative social imaginaries, but our spatial social imaginary lags behind or has been stalled by fear or complacency. And I want to give you two of many examples that are out there in the field of people trying to produce this kind of, and there are many, I know, but you tell me more in a moment perhaps. So I found a very inspiring story that appeared in the New York Times 2009 of a group of 25 long-term unemployed Polish men who got together and started building a ship, which you see there in the making, in order to start sailing across the world. And here's another current development in Greece of reinventing being in nature and working with nature. It's called Free and Real. It's a small commune in Evia as a way out of the crisis. So these are two of many small-scale examples of people trying to reinvent this relationship with nature at a very small individualized scale, and they'll probably fail. But even if they fail to become generative forces for a broader social environmental transformation, these social environmental utopias will have succeeded in challenging the social fatalism of homelessness and unemployment. And it is this challenge, I argue, that distinguishes these visions for a prime shelter from the neoliberal visions for private paradises. So it is this spatial praxis, this materialization, that lags behind and has been stalled by fear. And it is today, there is quite a bit of fear and that any new attempt to think in a radically different way about nature, society, design of the economy, fear that this will lead to the oppressive outcomes that we have seen in the past in the form of communism, Nazism, fascism, etc. However, at this moment of social, environmental and economic crisis is the best moment, I argue, for transformative thinking. It is the moment where radical imaginaries stop being just abstract intellectual design exercises, and the need to produce a new radical imaginary becomes a social necessity. If we take seriously Hannah Arendt's work or Cornelius Castoriadis' work, that history is the creation of new meanings and new social imaginaries, there is no better moment than now for creating these new social-spatial imaginaries. No better moment than now to counterpose fear of failure with Beckett's command. To try again and fail again, but try to fail better next time. An autonomous society that dares to fail again by thinking differently. And today we live in a moment that we cannot afford not to reinvent this socio-environmental relationship, even if we have to fail again. And it is a moment that we cannot afford not to reset the academic agenda, and this is precisely what we're doing here with this project, and that's why we're all so committed and so proud and so thankful to everybody who put the effort in to make this happen. Because students today enter professional schools, particularly in the UK and the US, but I think everywhere really, in search of some kind of environmental wisdom, and they graduate as technocrats and practitioners of ecological risk analysis and environmental management. The students are trained in schools to rationalize environmental problems as market problems and try to find solutions through market tools. So our academic world reproduces the same bodies of practice and discourse as top executive management teams of global corporations. So it is a moment to think differently and dare to fail, but let's try to fail better next time collectively. Thank you.